The snow came down in curtains that morning, thick and relentless, burying the wagon ruts that led into Caldwell Creek so completely that Clara Weston nearly missed the town altogether. She had been walking for 2 hours, her boots soaked through, her coat, a thin wool thing better suited to the Missouri spring she had left behind than to a Montana November, pressed tight against her ribs by the wind. She carried everything she owned in a canvas bag that had belonged to her father, and everything she owned amounted to very little. A change of clothes, a small Bible with her mother's name written inside the cover in faded ink, a letter of recommendation from the schoolmistress in Jefferson City that she had never had occasion to use, and 43 cents. She had not intended to end up in Caldwell Creek. She had intended to reach Helena, where a women's boarding house advertised clean rooms and domestic work in the territorial newspaper she had read 6 weeks ago on the train platform in St. Louis. But the stage had broken an axle outside of Billings, and the connecting coach had not waited, and one ride offered in charity by a farmer heading north had deposited her at a crossroads with instruction to follow the left fork for 12 miles. She had followed it, and here she was. Caldwell Creek was not much to look at even through clear weather, she supposed. In the snow it was barely visible at all. A general store, a livery, a small church with a crooked steeple, a saloon that looked like it had been built in a hurry and never improved upon, and a scattering of houses set back from the single road that ran through the center of everything. Smoke rose from chimneys. A dog barked somewhere and then went quiet. A man in a heavy coat crossed from the livery to the store without looking up. Clara stood at the edge of town and considered her options. They were not numerous. She had 43 cents and wet feet, and the temperature was still falling. The sky had the particular pale gray color that suggested it intended to snow for a very long time. She adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder and walked toward the general store because it was the closest building and because the light inside it looked warm. A bell above the door announced her arrival. The store smelled of tobacco and dried herbs and the pleasant dusty scent of grain sacks stacked in rows. A woman behind the counter looked up, middle-aged, sturdy, with the kind of competent face that suggested she had seen most things worth seeing and was not easily surprised by any of them. "Help you?" she said. "I hope so," Clara said. She was aware that she looked exactly as bad as she felt, wet and cold and hollowed out by 2 days of inadequate sleep and inadequate food. She stood up straight anyway. Her mother had always said that posture was the last thing a woman should surrender, even when everything else was gone. "I'm looking for work, any kind of work. I'm a hard worker. I can cook and clean, and I'm good with numbers if anyone needs bookkeeping. I taught Sunday school for 3 years." The woman studied her for a moment. "Where'd you come from?" "Missouri, originally. I was headed for Helena, but I missed my connection. MM." The woman leaned on the counter. "Name's Ruth Hadley. My husband and I run this store. Clara Weston." "Well, Clara Weston, I'll be plain with you because it's too cold for anything else. I don't have work. My husband's nephew is already clerking for us, and we can't carry another wage. The saloon doesn't hire women for anything respectable, and I don't imagine you're looking for the other kind of work. The church doesn't pay. The schoolteacher position was filled in September." She paused. "There's one other thing, but I don't know how you'd feel about it." Clara felt the cold in her boots and thought about 43 cents. "Tell me." Ruth Hadley reached under the counter and produced a piece of paper that had been folded and unfolded many times, its creases soft with handling. She set it on the counter and smoothed it flat. "James Calloway put this up about 6 weeks ago. He's got a ranch up about 4 miles north. Lost his wife 2 winters back. He's got 2 kids, a boy and a girl, 7 and 9, and a working ranch that needs a woman's hand. He put this notice up asking for a wife. She looked at Clara steadily. He's a decent man. I've known him 15 years. He doesn't drink to excess, and he doesn't have a cruel bone in him. He's not looking for anything improper. He needs a partner and a mother for those children, and he said so plainly in the notice. Clara looked at the paper. The handwriting was careful and slightly stiff, the writing of a man who had thought hard about every word. It described the ranch and the children and the work honestly and without embellishment. It said he was 30, 4 years old and healthy. It said he would expect nothing from a wife that she was not willing to give, and that he understood such an arrangement would take time and trust to become a true marriage in every sense. It said he could offer a warm home and security and fair treatment, and that he hoped to offer more than that in time, if the right woman was willing to try. Clara read it twice. She was 20, 6 years old. She had not come to Montana looking for a husband. She had come looking for work and independence and a chance to build something of her own, the way her father had always said a person could do in the West if they had enough determination. Her father had died of a fever in the spring and left her with a rented room she could no longer pay for and a job at a laundry that closed 2 weeks later when the owner retired. Independence was a fine thing to want, but you had to be alive to pursue it. "How do I get to his ranch?" she said. Ruth Hadley smiled for the first time. It was a small smile, but it was genuine. She came around the counter and poured Clara a cup of coffee from a pot on the stove, and told her to sit and get warm, because there was no sense going out in this weather until it eased. She sent her nephew to the livery to ask after any wagon heading north. She brought out bread and cold ham from the back and set it in front of Clara without comment, and Clara ate it slowly and with enormous gratitude and said nothing about the fact that she had not eaten since yesterday morning. By early afternoon the snow had lightened to a thin drift, and there was a wagon heading north past the Calloway place. The nephew, whose name was Eddie and who was 17 and seemed to find the whole situation very romantic, helped Clara up onto the bench beside the driver, an old man named Harris who had approximately 4 teeth and no interest in conversation, and they set off into the white and frozen landscape at a pace slightly faster than walking. Clara watched the country open up around her. Even in winter, even gray and buried in snow, there was something in this land that reached into her chest and pressed against something she didn't have a name for. The mountains rose in the distance, enormous and calm, their peaks lost in cloud. The land between was wide and sweeping, undulant like a slow sea frozen in place. She had never seen anything so large and so quiet. Missouri had beautiful country, but it was a gentle beauty, settled and knowable. This was something else. This was country that did not care whether you found it beautiful or not. It simply was, immense and indifferent, and somehow that was more impressive than any landscape she had ever tried to appreciate. Harris stopped the wagon at a gate post with a C burned into the wood and said Calloway, without looking at her. She climbed down, thanked him, and watched the wagon continue north until she could no longer hear the creak of its wheels. She stood at the gate for a moment. The ranch house was visible down a long drive, a low, solid structure built of notched timber, with a wide porch and smoke rising thick and steady from 2 chimneys. There were outbuildings, a proper barn, fencing that was in good repair, a kitchen garden, she thought, though it was hard to tell under the snow. The place had the look of a ranch that was worked hard and maintained with care. Whatever James Calloway was, he was not idle. She opened the gate and walked down the drive. She was halfway to the house when the door opened and 2 children appeared on the porch with the particular explosive energy of children who have been inside all day and have run out of patience. For it, they stopped when they saw her, The girl was older, dark-haired and serious-faced, watching Clara with cautious eyes. The boy was younger, round-cheeked, wearing one boot and one sock, and holding the other boot in his hand as though he had been mid-process when something more interesting occurred. "Are you the lady from the notice?" The girl said. "I might be." Clara said, "Is your father home?" "He's in the barn." The boy said, "I'm Thomas. She's Eliza. You're very wet." "I am," Clara agreed. "It's been a long walk." "Papa said nobody was coming because nobody answered the notice," Eliza said. She had not moved from her spot on the porch, and her expression remained carefully neutral. The expression of a child who has learned not to expect things. "He said he was going to take it down." "Well, I'm here now," Clara said. "Should we go find him?" They went around the side of the house to the barn, the children flanking her, Thomas having put his boot on somewhere along the way. The barn was warm with animal heat, and smelled of hay and horses, and the particular rich darkness of a well-kept working space. 2 horses occupied stalls on the left. A man was at the far end, repairing a section of harness by lamplight, and he looked up when they came in. He was tall. That was the first thing she registered, tall and broad through the shoulders, with the kind of physical solidity that comes not from any particular effort, but from years of hard physical work done consistently. He had dark hair going gray at the temples and a face that had been weathered by sun and wind into something that was not exactly handsome in any conventional way, but was deeply, specifically itself. A face with character, her mother would have said, strong jaw, serious eyes that were somewhere between gray and green, and were currently regarding her with an expression of careful surprise. He set down the harness and straightened. "Can I help you?" "My name is Clara Weston. I saw your notice at the general store in Caldwell Creek. Mrs. Hadley told me about your situation." She stopped herself from saying more than that. She did not want to sound desperate, though she was. She did not want to beg, though she was closer to it than she'd ever been in her life. "I've come to discuss the position." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at her with those gray-green eyes, and she had the disconcerting sense that he was seeing her quite clearly, the wet coat, the worn bag, the particular set of a person's jaw when they are holding themselves together by determination alone. "You walked from town," he said. "I got a ride most of the way." "In this weather?" "It wasn't as bad by afternoon." He was quiet again. Then he said, "Come inside. You should be warm when we talk." He sent Thomas to bring in more wood and Eliza to put water on, and he held the door for Clara and took her wet coat without being asked and hung it near the fire. The house was what she'd hoped from outside, solid and clean and functional, though it had the particular quality of a house maintained by a man and children, which is to say that it was clean in the ways a man thinks of and less attended to in others. The curtains needed washing. There was no softness anywhere, no cushions on the chairs, no cloths on the tables, nothing decorative except a small framed picture of a woman on the mantelpiece, who Clara recognized immediately as someone who was no longer living. James Calloway made coffee. He did it efficiently and without fuss, moving around his own kitchen with the ease of a man who had learned to do things for himself out of necessity. He set a cup in front of her and one in front of himself, and sat across the table and looked at her. "Tell me about yourself," he said. She told him. She told him plainly and completely, the way she had read his notice, honestly and without embellishment. Missouri, her father's death, the lost job, the missed stage. She told him she was 26 and had never been married and had no family left to speak of. She told him what she could do and what she could not. She said she was not afraid of hard work and had never been a fragile person, though she was aware she looked it at the moment. She said she understood the arrangement he was proposing and that she was willing to consider it seriously, though she thought they ought to be honest with each other about the strangeness of what they were discussing. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he sat for a moment turning his coffee cup slowly on the table. "It is strange," he said. "I won't pretend otherwise. When I wrote that notice I felt foolish, and I still feel a little foolish talking about it out loud." He glanced toward the other room, where the sounds of children could be heard. "But those two need more than I can give them on my own, and this ranch needs two people. I knew that when Margaret was alive, and I've known it harder every year since." He looked at Clara. "I'm not asking you to love me. I'm asking you to try. There's a difference. There is," she said. "I'll tell you what I can offer and you can decide. The house is warm and I keep it provisioned. You'd have your own room to start, your own space, your own time inside the bounds of what the work allows. You'd have say over how the house is run and how the children are raised. I'd listen to you. I'm not a man who thinks his way is the only way." He paused. "And I'd be honest with you, always, that I can promise without qualification." Clara looked at the fire. She thought about the 43 cents in her pocket. She thought about Helena and the women's boarding house and the life she'd imagined building for herself, slow and independent, answering to no one. She thought about her father saying that the West was a place where a person could build something. And she thought that perhaps building something with another person was not so different from building it alone, if the other person was honest and the foundation was sound. She thought about Eliza's careful, guarded face, and the way the girl had said nobody answered the notice, as though she had already made peace with disappointment. "I'd want to know the children," she said, "before I decided, a week, maybe, to see if it could work." He nodded. "That's fair. And if it doesn't work, if either of us decides it's not right, I'd need you to help me get to Helena, stage fair, done," he said. "Then I'll stay a week," she said. He extended his hand across the table, and she shook it, and that was how it began. The week was not easy, and it was not simple, and she was fairly certain that easy and simple were not things this life offered in any abundance. The work started before first light and ended after dark, and in between there was an unbroken chain of tasks that needed doing, cooking and cleaning and mending, and the kitchen chores, yes, but also carrying wood and tending the kitchen garden's cold frames and helping with the lesser ranch work when her hands were free, feeding the chickens, checking on the cow that had been off her feed. The cold was a constant. She had never understood cold the way she understood it here, not as a season but as a presence, something that lived in the walls and under the floors and came in every time the door opened and had to be fought back continuously. She fell into bed every night with the bone, deep tiredness of genuine physical labor, and she woke every morning and did it again, and somewhere in the middle of the third day she noticed that she was not miserable. She was tired and cold and uncertain about a great many things, but underneath all of that there was something that she gradually identified as the feeling of usefulness, of being precisely where her hands and her mind were needed, of watching things improve because of her presence. She fixed the curtains on the third day. She organized the pantry on the fourth. She started teaching Eliza a more rigorous method of arithmetic in the evenings, and discovered that the girl was quietly, seriously brilliant, absorbing information with a focused intensity that reminded Clara of herself at that age. Thomas was easier. Thomas had decided she was wonderful sometime around the first hour and had not reconsidered. He followed her around asking questions in a continuous stream and reported her answers to his father at dinner as though they were important news. James Calloway was harder to know than his children. He was not cold, not distant in any unfriendly sense, but he was contained, a man who had pulled himself back inside himself at some point, and had not entirely found the way to come forward again. He was kind and reliable, and he kept every small thing he said he would do. He asked her opinion at dinner about decisions regarding the ranch, and listened to her answers with genuine attention. He noticed when she looked tired and quietly redistributed the work without making a point of it. He told her about the ranch's history in the evenings sometimes, how his grandfather had come from Tennessee and how his father had built the house, and she told him about Missouri and her father's farm and the people she had grown up among. And these conversations had the quality of two people not so much talking as learning the shape of each other by careful degrees. On the 6th evening there was a storm, a real one this time, not the mild snow of her arrival, but a full blizzard that came down off the mountains with a kind of contemptuous ease and buried the world in the span of 2 hours. They got the children to bed and sat by the fire in the main room and listened to the wind, and James poured 2 small glasses of whiskey and set one in front of her without asking, because he had learned in 6 days that she would say yes if asked and preferred not to have to ask. "You've decided, I think," he said. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the fire. She considered pretending she hadn't. "Is it that obvious? You reorganized the root cellar today. People don't reorganize root cellars in places they're planning to leave." She laughed. She hadn't laughed much in a long while, and it surprised her, the ease of it. "I've decided," she said. "If you still want." He looked at her then. "I still want." The wind pressed against the walls of the house, and the fire crackled, and she thought that there were worse things than this, worse things than a warm room in a hard country, than a steady and honest man across the table, than children asleep down the hall who were beginning, slowly and cautiously, to need her. She had come to Montana looking for something to build. She had not expected it to already be partially built, waiting, with space for her specifically in its architecture. But perhaps that was the thing about the West, her father had not quite managed to explain, that sometimes what you built was not made from scratch, but from the joining of separate sturdy things into something stronger. "We should go to town," she said, "before the next storm. Christmas week," he said. "The passes will be clear enough." She nodded. Outside the blizzard went on, that vast impersonal fury, and inside the fire held it at bay, and the house was warm, and she sat with her small glass of whiskey and felt, for the first time in a long time, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. They were married in the Caldwell Creek Church on a Wednesday in December, 2 weeks after she arrived, with Ruth Hadley and her husband as witnesses and Eddie as the unintentional best man on account of being the only other person present who was not clergy. Thomas wore a clean shirt and managed to keep it clean for the entire ceremony, which everyone agreed was remarkable. Eliza stood very still and very straight beside Clara, and at the end, as they were leaving the church, she took Clara's hand with a deliberate, careful intentionality that said everything she had not yet found words for. It snowed on the drive home. It snowed almost every day. But the house was warm, and the work was real, and the life that assembled itself around her in those first months was nothing she had imagined and nothing she would have thought to want. And yet it fit her the way well-made things fit, not perfectly, not without friction, but truly, in the way that means it was made for use and not for looking at. She wrote a letter to the women's boarding house in Helena to say she would not be needing a room. She wrote it on a Sunday afternoon while James was mending tack at the kitchen table, and Thomas was sleeping on the rug by the fire, and Eliza was reading with that fierce, focused attention that Clara had come to love with a fierceness of her own. She did not know yet all that the years would bring. She did not know the droughts or the hard winters or the season the cattle sickened or the morning she would stand on the porch watching James come back from the north pasture and feel, with a sudden and overwhelming clarity, that what had begun as a practical arrangement had become something neither of them had quite planned for. She did not know the particular quality of a Montana morning in May when the snow is gone and the grass comes up green and sudden, and everything that seemed impossible in February announces itself as having been waiting patiently all along. She did not know any of it yet. She folded the letter and sealed it and set it with the outgoing mail and looked out the window at the snow coming down steady and white, covering everything, and she thought that winter was not ending but a patience, a long, necessary, clarifying patience, and that what came after it was worth the waiting, if you had somewhere warm to wait. Outside the snow fell and fell. Inside the fire held.